They spent 9 months in a stone coffin, eating 700 penguins. When found, their faces were black masks of soot and grease. The scientists had become monsters, and the ice was still hungry for more. The stone walls of the hut are weeping black slime. A thick, greasy soot from burning blubber hangs in the air like a heavy curtain. The smell of rancid penguin oil and unwashed skin fills the cramped, dark space. A match strikes with a sharp hiss. The tiny flame reveals 3 faces that are no longer human. They are masks of cracked carbon and deep frozen fissures. Black grease fills every wrinkle, turning their skin into charred leather. One man reaches for a tin of gray meat. His fingers are raw, stained with old blood and animal fat. He cannot feel the jagged edge of the metal digging into his palm. The nerves died months ago, in the frost. Outside, the wind screams with the sound of 1,000 dying horses. It batters the basalt rocks, searching for a gap to enter. The ice beneath them groans and cracks, like the spine of a giant snapping in the dark. Johann stares at the flickering lamp. His eyes are yellowed, sunken deep into a skull draped in soot. He does not remember the taste of bread, or the warmth of a fire that does not choke the lungs. He looks at his companions. They are breathing in unison, a wet, rattling sound that echoes off the low ceiling. Their shadows dance on the walls like distorted demons. They are the living dead, preserved by the salt. Suddenly, the ice floor beneath them heaves upward. A sound like thunder shatters the silence of the stone tomb. The blubber lamp tips over, plunging the world into a suffocating, absolute darkness. The freezing ocean is coming for them. The water hisses against the hot stones. In the dark, a hand fumbles for a knife. Not for defense, but for a quicker end. They have reached the limit of the soul. How did the world of light become this? The Swedish Dream began with the white canvas of a map that had no lines. In the year 1901, the world still had secrets. Otto Nordenskjold believed he could unlock the last great vault of the planet. The Swedish expedition set sail with the arrogance of men who thought nature was a problem to be solved with iron and steam. They boarded the Antarctic, a sturdy vessel built of green heartwood and driven by coal. They wore wool suits and polished leather boots. They carried brass telescopes and glass slides for their microscopes. To them, the South was a laboratory, not a graveyard. They sailed into the blue waters with champagne and cheers. The plan was a clockwork machine of logic. The ship would drop Nordenskjold and 5 others at Snow Hill Island. Captain Larsen would then sail north to the open sea, returning when the sun reappeared after the winter. But the Antarctic summer of 1902 was a deception. The sun stayed high in the sky, reflecting off the ice like a polished blade. The men built their wooden hut with steady, rhythmic hammers. They did not hear the warning in the wind. They did not see the way the pack ice was beginning to thicken like cooling wax. They worked with the optimism of the 19th century, believing in the inevitable victory of science. The separation happened on a clear, freezing afternoon. The Antarctic pulled away from the shore, its black smoke smudging the pristine sky. The men on the beach waved their hats, until the ship became a tiny speck. That speck was their only link to the world of warmth and bread. As the ship vanished, a heavy silence descended over Snow Hill. It was the sound of a door locking from the outside. The trap was set. The first mistake was the belief in cycles. They expected the ice to follow the patterns of the past. But the earth shifted. The currents changed. The frozen sea began to knit itself together with unnatural speed and strength. By the time the calendar turned to 1903, the sea was no longer water. It was a jagged pavement of white stone. Captain Larsen looked south from the crow's nest and saw only a solid wall. The point of no return arrived when the coal began to run low. Every shove against the ice cost a precious ton of fuel. The ship groaned, its wooden ribs complaining against the pressure of 1,000,000 tons of frozen ocean. They were still smiling in their photographs. They were still writing neat entries in their journals about geological formations and weather patterns. They did not know that the ice had already decided their fate. It was waiting. The optimism of Sweden felt very far away now. The white horizon stretched forever. Indifferent to their maps and their names, the laboratory was gone. The survival of the human animal was the only science that remained. The date was February 12th, 1903. The Antarctic was no longer a ship. It had become a victim. The ice had fingers of white iron that squeezed the wooden hull. With a slow and rhythmic cruelty, every timber in the vessel shrieked. The sound was not like wood. It was like the bones of a titan snapping in a dark room. Captain Larsen stood on the tilted deck and listened to the death rattle of his pride. The ice did not just push. It lifted. It lunged. It drove jagged flows through the thick green heart planks as if they were wet paper. Water began to pour into the hold. A freezing black tide that smelled of oil and salt. Abandoned ship. The order was a funeral oration. The men scrambled onto the shifting ice, throwing crates of hardtack and sacks of flour onto the floes. They worked with the frantic energy of ants whose hill has been crushed. They watched from the ice as the Antarctic surrendered. The masts tilted toward the gray sky like praying arms. The bow dipped. The stern rose. With a final, sickening gurgle of trapped air, the ship slid into the abyss. A terrible silence followed. The sound of the crushing ice had stopped, replaced by the hollow whistle of the wind. There was no wood, no steam, no shelter. Just 25 men standing on a floating white island in the middle of nowhere. The expedition was now a three-headed ghost. Nordenskjold was isolated in his wooden hut on Snow Hill. 3 men had been dropped at Hope Bay to find him. The rest were now castaways on a drifting grave. None of them knew the others were still alive. To Nordenskjold, the ship was simply late. To the men at Hope Bay, the ship had vanished into the fog. To the castaways, the land was a distant, unreachable dream. The geography of hope had been replaced by the geometry of fear. They were separated by miles of churning ice and freezing water. The realization hit them like a physical blow. There was no rescue coming from the sea. The first blood was not shed by a knife. It was the spirit that began to bleed first. They looked at their meager piles of supplies. They looked at the vast, empty horizon. The Antarctic was gone, and the predator had arrived. The predator was the cold. It was not a temperature. It was a living thing that wanted to stop their hearts. It waited for them to sleep. It waited for them to lose their resolve. The long night was beginning. The 3 men at Hope Bay watched the horizon until their eyes burned with salt. The ship did not return. They were alone with the rocks and the wind. They had to build a tomb to stay alive. They gathered heavy blocks of basalt and piled them into a low, crooked hut. They used frozen penguin guano as mortar to seal the gaps. The roof was made of flat stones and the remains of a single sled. The space was 6 feet wide and 9 feet long. Inside, there was only darkness and the smell of the damp earth. They crawled in on their bellies like animals seeking a burrow. The stone coffin was finished. They became the hunters of the bay. They killed 700 penguins with clubs and knives. The blood turned the white shore into a red nightmare. Every day was a war for calories. They ate the meat boiled over a small stove fueled by seal blubber. The grease was thick and yellow. It coated their tongues and lined their stomachs with a heavy, sickly film. The smoke was a living thief. It stole the light and the air. A greasy black soot covered everything in the stone hut. It settled in their hair and filled the deep cracks in their frozen hands. Their skin turned the color of coal. They could not wash with ice, so the oil became a second skin. They looked at each other in the dim light of the blubber lamp and saw strangers with blackened faces. The polar night descended like a heavy iron lid. For months, the sun did not rise. They lived in a world of shadows and the constant, rhythmic sound of the wind screaming through the basalt cracks. Time lost its shape. They spent 20 hours a day in their sleeping bags to save their body heat. They talked about bread. They talked about the green forests of Sweden until the words felt like hallucinations. Their bodies began to fail. Muscles withered until their joints protruded like knots in a rope. Their teeth ached. Their lungs felt heavy with the soot of the blubber smoke. They were breathing in their own decay. Isolation turned their minds into jagged things. Every cough and every movement of a companion felt like an attack. They were three souls trapped in a dark box, buried under the weight of the Antarctic winter. How much of a man remains when the light is gone? They were no longer scientists or explorers. They were creatures of the smoke. They were the blackened men, waiting for a dawn that seemed like a myth. The spring sun returned as a cold and mocking eye. It illuminated the wreckage of their lives but offered no warmth. At Hope Bay, the three blackened men crawled out of their stone tomb for the final time. They began the desperate trek toward Snow Hill Island. Their legs were thin as dry kindling. Every step across the shifting sea ice was a gamble with gravity. The world around them was breaking into jagged white shards. The ice was melting. Deep blue veins of open water opened beneath their feet. They hauled their sled over ridges of pressure ice that looked like frozen waves. Their breath came in ragged gasps that tasted of copper. On the other side of the frozen strait, Nordenskjold stepped out of his wooden hut. He scanned the horizon with his telescope. He saw three dark specks moving slowly across the blinding white expanse of the bay. He thought they were animals. He thought they were stray seals, or perhaps large penguins. He grabbed his rifle and walked out to meet them. The distance between the survivors began to shrink in the shimmering heat. As the figures drew closer, the horror became clear. These were not animals. They were tall, bipedal creatures draped in tattered rags and blackened furs. Their faces were as dark as polished obsidian under the sun. Nordenskjold raised his weapon, his heart hammering against his ribs. He did not recognize his own colleagues. The creatures stopped. They did not speak. They simply stared with yellowed eyes from deep within their soot-caked skulls. One of the specters raised a hand. A raspy, broken voice called out a name from a world that no longer existed. The recognition hit Nordenskjold like a physical blow. These were the men he had sent away. The groups converged in a silent embrace. There was no joy, only the heavy weight of shared survival. But the reunion was a brief victory. Their food was gone. Their bodies were finished. They were still trapped. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the howl of the wind. It was the deep, resonant blast of a steam whistle. They turned their heads toward the open lead of water. A red hull was slicing through the ice. The Argentine corvette Uruguay appeared like a ghost ship from the mist. It was a miracle of steel and smoke. The rescuers on the deck looked down at the beach and saw a huddle of charred, broken men. They were saved by a single day. The ice began to break apart into 1,000 pieces as the men were rowed to the ship. The Antarctic was finally letting go of its prisoners, but it kept its secrets. The arrival in Buenos Aires was a parade of ghosts. Thousands of people lined the docks to witness the return of men who had been mourned as dead. The survivors stood on the deck of the Uruguay like statues of salt. They wore clean wool and soft linen, but the change was only on the surface. Underneath the fresh clothes, their skin still bore the faint yellow stain of seal blubber. Their eyes remained fixed on a horizon that no longer existed. The world celebrated a triumph of the human spirit. The newspapers spoke of heroism and the indomitable will of Sweden. But for the men who had lived in the stone coffin, the victory felt hollow and cold as ice. One name was absent from the cheers and the toasts. Olwen Nordenskjold did not stand among his comrades. He remained behind, buried beneath a lonely cairn of basalt rocks on the frozen shore of Paulet Island. The stones over his body were the only monument in a land that remembers nothing. He died of a heart that simply stopped, tired of beating against the absolute silence. He was the price the ice demanded for the others. Years later, the wooden hut on Snow Hill still stands. The wind has polished the timber until it shines like bone. Inside, the dust settles on abandoned crates and rusted tins. It is a cathedral built for a god of frost. The basalt hut at Hope Bay has collapsed into a pile of jagged shadows. The bones of 700 penguins are buried deep beneath the snow. The earth has reclaimed the red stains, turning the nightmare back into white. What remains of the Swedish expedition is not found in the geological samples or the faded maps. It is found in the way the survivors jumped at the sound of a cracking fire, or the smell of smoke. They had peered into the void, and the void had left a mark upon their souls. They proved that a man can survive the impossible winter, but they also learned that survival is a type of slow and quiet scarring. Nature is not a laboratory. It is an ancient predator that watches and waits. It allows us to walk across its frozen skin for a time, but it never grants us permission to stay. We are only ever guests. The legacy of the Antarctic is a lesson in humility. The ice does not care about our science or our dreams. It only cares about the wind and the salt, and the slow, grinding movement of the great white clock. The story of the blackened men ends not with a shout, but with the sound of the tide. The sea continues to churn, and the ice continues to squeeze. The white continent remains silent, beautiful, and perfectly, terrifyingly indifferent.